Well, welcome to my third lecture. You'll remember that when we talked about time travel, we found that doing very small changes actually led to quite big problems. Instead of our usual way of traveling forwards in time, if you started thinking about the situation where people travel back in time, then you get into all sorts of wonderful problems about what's true, what's false, what's necessary, what's not necessary, what's possible and what's impossible. And one of the problems that you might ask, and a problem that I actually put at the end of the very last lecture, was, what about time travelers? How do you know that the person who comes out of the time machine is actually the same as the person who went into it? And this is a particularly acute problem if you think about the many worlds interpretation we discussed briefly. When the time traveler hops to a new possible world by interfering in the past, how do you know that that's the same person, not just some kind of copy or counterpart of the person that's in the new world? And that's a question that relates to our new topic, personal identity. And so for this lecture and the following one, I'm going to talk a bit about personal identity. Now, I used to teach an honors course on personal identity. There's a lot to be said on this, and I'm going to try and squeeze just some of this material into 2 lectures. I hope I don't go either too fast or too slow. We'll see as we go along. Personal identity deals with a fundamental puzzle that each one of us has, which is what makes me, me? Actually, what makes you, you is more interesting to you. What makes me, me is the puzzle that I face. The puzzle you face is what makes you, you. Who or what am I? Sometimes when we look at pictures from our past, we say things like, was that really me? Here I am in the Longships Museum in Norway. Was that really me? My God, why did I have my mouth open like that? And why was I wearing that awful shirt? Oh, was that me too? That's in Fremantle at the Art Centre. Oh dear, not a flattering picture either. Oh, but look, there's me with my old dog, who's now been dead for many years. But at least the dog takes a good picture, doesn't he? And when we look at these pictures and we think back, we say, who was I? Was that me? And the older you get, the longer you live, the more puzzled you become when you look at pictures of yourself when you're quite young. Now, if I continue to exist as me, what is it that keeps me being me? What is it that maintains my identity through time, as we might put it? And that's a really interesting question. Is it because I just have the same body, the body that's changing as it ages, as it grows older, as it falls sick, as it gets better? Is it just that body that makes me who I am? That's one possibility. Or maybe there are parts of my body that are more important than others. In the past, people used to think it was the heart that was actually very important to your identity and that your soul resided in your heart. Nowadays, we tend to think it's what's in your head that's more important, and maybe your brain. Maybe it's your brain that preserves your identity. Or maybe it's something not quite physical. Maybe it's not something as concrete as a body or a brain. Maybe it's more your mind or your conscious awareness. Or maybe it's even the program that's running, the software that's running on your bodily hardware. So when you start thinking about it, there's lots of ways in which you can actually formulate this question. Why do I continue to exist as me? And of course, there are some people, there are some religions, there are some philosophies that actually deny that we continue to exist as a unified self through time. Many Buddhists, for example, take the view that the notion we have of the self is actually a delusion. And in fact, there isn't one self, one person that is you throughout your life. So these are really interesting and puzzling questions, and that's what I want to talk about today and introduce us to. Now, in philosophy, there are some normal answers. I've called them the usual answers to this question, just to introduce them to you very quickly. And they are sometimes called the body criterion of personal identity, which says that to be you, for me to be me, is for our bodies just to continue existing. So what makes me me is the continuity of a particular human body. There's another criterion for personal identity usually called the memory criterion. And the memory criterion says, no, it's not just your body that makes you you. It's actually your consciousness of your past, your expectations of your future, in particular, the memories you have and the way that you're able to build up a narrative and a story connecting those memories. And so the memory criterion says that your identity is actually tied in some way, as we'll see in a moment, a way that's not very clear, to the extent of your memories. Okay, let's do a space-time diagram. You must be getting good at recognizing space-time diagrams by now. Here's another one. Time on the vertical, space on the horizontal. And as usual, I'll represent a lifeline here. Let's pretend it's my lifeline. We'll represent a lifeline here just as a straight line. Of course, it shouldn't be a straight line. It actually should be a wiggly worm line. It should be a wiggly worm because if we are worms, if my life is a worm through the fabric of space-time, if we're worming our way through space-time, then of course on the collapsed spatial horizontal axis, we should show our movements through space. But of course, I have great difficulty with my computer program drawing wiggly lines, so I draw a straight line, and you can perhaps imagine that that wiggles like a worm, my space-time worm. Now, worms have segments, and of course, what I've said when I've been lecturing on time is that we can think of the timeline of a person, a four-dimensional being extended through space and time. We can think of that timeline being divided into time slices. And I introduced in the last lecture the terminology stages, talk about stages of your timeline. Some other writers, if you're looking at your reading, you'll see they talk about temporal parts. And stages or temporal parts can be long or short. You can have a momentary stage of your time. Oh, look, it's gone. My momentary stage is past, and I'm on to my next stage, right? Or you can say, let's take the stage, let's take the temporal slice of Andrew that exists all the way through his lecture. And so you can take a 1 hour long slice, or a 40-minute slice, or a 50-minute slice, or you can take a 1 year slice. So these stages in our lives, we can divide them up arbitrarily. And having said that, I can now introduce the standard way of thinking about what it is for you to have a continuous body through space and time. What it would be for your identity to depend on the continuity through space and time of your body. And continuity is actually quite easy. Actually, you need some mathematics to represent it, but this is not a technical subject, so we are not going to do it mathematically. I'll just explain it non-mathematically. Think about slicing up your timeline in any way you like. Think of taking temporal slices, stages of various slices and thicknesses from your timeline. Now, imagine you take two stages. The closer in time you take these stages together, the greater the spatial overlap there is between them. Imagine that you're taking a video of a ball rolling along the ground quite slowly. The ball is rolling around the ground, and you've taken a video of it. Now go back to your video, and you take a still that you capture at this point in the film, and you take another still you capture 5 seconds later. If you look at the two stills, it'll look as if the ball's hopped, won't it? Because they're 5 seconds apart, and the ball's moved quite a long way in 5 seconds. But if you take a still that's only half a second from the first still that you take, it will just look as if the ball's made a tiny little jerky movement. And if you get closer and closer, if you take a still that's only a 1/12 of a second different in time from your original still, you won't be able to see that the ball's moved at all. So continuity, understood in this way, says the closer in time any two stages or temporal parts are, the greater the spatial overlap between them. And so when you see me moving around, if I move in the lecture, I don't move jerkily. Well, not very jerkily. I move smoothly because my body is moving continuously in space and time. The closer together you take the slices, the more the overlap, the less difference in spatial displacement between them. So that's bodily continuity. Memory is actually much harder to deal with, and today we're going to talk about memory. Some theorists have said that our self-awareness our awareness of ourselves as ourselves, our awareness of me as me, you as you, him as him, her as her. Our self-awareness extends only as far as our memory does. And that can be direct in that I can remember directly some incidents, even from my childhood. I can remember directly some incidents from last week. So I've got direct memory connections to various bits of my past. Another theorists have said that doesn't matter so much so long as there are indirect memory connections. I now can remember what I did some of the time last week. And last week I could remember what I did some of the time the week before. And the week before I could remember what I was doing some of the time the week before that. And of course you can build up an indirect chain of memory all the way back to your childhood in that way. So our self-awareness, people say, extends as far as our memory does, either directly or indirectly, even though everyone recognizes that as time goes by, we lose memories. In fact, it doesn't take very long to lose memories. By the end of today, I will have forgotten hundreds of things that happened during the day. By the end of next week, I'll have forgotten thousands of things. And so one question you ask when faced with these two ideas, the bodily criterion of personal identity, the memory criterion of personal identity, one question you ask is, are we just bodies, or does memory play a role in personal identity? Now, as you'd expect, Hollywood and other movie sources give us great inspiration for thinking about these things. One of the classic films to consider when you're thinking about memory and personal identity is Memento. There's Guy Pearce. You can also think about Being John Malkovich, and you can also think about The Matrix. But I don't want to think about The Matrix because we've already done intelligent, hyper-intelligent machines when we were talking about time travel. And it's quite interesting. All these movies were made around the late 90s, as if there was a kind of interesting identity among scriptwriters and directors then. And they raise questions, rather like the questions we're looking at today. How much change can someone undergo and still be the very same person? Because we change all the time. But is there a limit to how much we can change while still being the same? Could I lose many, or indeed most of my memories? Or could I, like Leonard in Memento, lose memories after a certain point in time and yet still be me? And as I say, we won't talk about The Matrix, but we will talk about Memento. Let's think about some of the questions that are raised by the movie Memento. Anyone seen Memento? Is it, oh, good. This is great. You're so good at looking at old movies. That's terrific. Okay. The plot goes something like this, in as much as I can recall it. It's a long time since I saw the movie. Leonard, played by the Guy Pearce character, has lost some of his memories, not all of them, but he's lost some of his memories due to trauma. And indeed, the memories that he's lost are memories of the events that have happened since the trauma. And the trauma is the death of his wife. And the movie starts out as a revenge movie. He's wanting to find out who killed his wife and take revenge. It's only as the movie progresses that you learn that he may himself be the person who killed his wife. Is that right? Have I got the plot? Have I remembered it? Yes? Now, in clinical terms, what Leonard is suffering from is usually called in the literature anti-retrograde amnesia. That's to say, his memory is intact up to some fairly traumatic event. And then, after that traumatic event, he's got these great horrifying gulfs or blanks in his memory. But the interesting thing is that, of course, Leonard actually functions pretty well. I mean, he's just an extreme version of me. I mean, I take pictures. That's a picture of Sagrada Familia in Barcelona when I was there a few years ago. And there was a crane, which you can't see, luckily. And I take pictures of other things that I know I'll forget. So I use pictures as a prop to my memory. He has to use notes, tattoos, and other clues, just the way someone like me uses pictures. I mean, look at the blue strawberries on the screen. Maybe it's not very clear, but I had to take a picture of this because I thought I might forget. I just saw this poster saying, "We are natural." And the picture that it shows are blue strawberries. And I thought, that's really weird. We are natural with a picture of blue strawberries. So I take pictures like that all the time just to remind me of things that otherwise I'll forget. And so I'm a bit like Leonard, except Leonard's an extreme case in Memento because he's always writing notes and post-it stickers and things on mirrors everywhere. He's got to write things because he's got no way of tracking his past since the horrific event. So does our conscious memory really matter to our identity? Does it matter to us being who we are? And so today's question is really going to look a little bit more into this whole issue of memory and identity. Now, the famous historic source for this, and I've put it on your reading, and it's widely available on the net, is work by an English philosopher called John Locke, who lived in the later part of the 17th century, died just at the turn of the 18th century in 1704. And as you see, he's rather anxious looking. I don't know why the pictures of Locke always make him look anxious, but he looks a bit nervous. Maybe he was worried about his identity. And Locke is very famous in political philosophy and political theory because he actually outlines the modern understanding of property. And his second treatise on government has this famous passage that everyone learns when they do political theory. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. And so what Locke is arguing here is that you actually have property in your own body. Your own body is your primary property. Anything that you mix your body's labor with, if you go and dig a field, you go and build a house, anything that you mix your labor with, in a derived sense, also becomes your property, because you've annexed, as it were, that thing by mixing your labor with it. And this became the foundation of modern property law and lots of thoughts about property. Now, the reason I give you this quote is not to talk about Locke's political theory, but to give you this idea that Locke took quite seriously the idea that our body was our primary property. But it doesn't follow from that that Locke thought that we are just bodies. And that's what I'm going to go on to show you, that he actually has a theory that's a bit different from what you'd expect. You might think that he thinks since our bodies are our primary property, then we are our bodies. But he doesn't think this at all. Now, Locke actually thinks that different kinds of thing have different conditions of identity. Different kinds of thing have different conditions of identity. And this is really exciting because he's the first philosopher who really tried to write clearly and systematically about the different identity conditions that different things had. He starts by talking about masses of matter. He means physical chunks of things, chunks of rock, bits of clay, bits of wood, things he calls masses of matter. And he thinks that masses of matter, atomic theory in Locke's day was pretty primitive. He thought that masses of matter were just jumbles of atoms all joined together. And he says that for a mass of matter to retain its identity is for it to keep all the same atoms that it originally has in it. If it loses one or two atoms, it's a different mass of matter. If it gains some atoms, it's a different mass of matter. So you get a very strict criterion of identity for masses of matter. But then he thought vegetables are different, because vegetables gain matter as they grow. So it can't be that losing an atom or two or gaining an atom or two makes any difference to the identity of a vegetable. And animals are even more different still, because animals move around. They grow much more dramatically than many vegetables, more dramatically than cabbages and radishes do, maybe not as dramatically as trees do. But animals grow very dramatically and change a lot between their juvenile stages and their adult stages. So it can't just be that they are masses of matter. They've got to be something more. And then human beings, or men as Locke calls them in his sexist English of the time, human beings actually maybe have different conditions of identity as well. And so he tried to lay out some kind of account of what the different kinds of conditions of identity were, bearing in mind the thought that each thing is the thing it is. And as long as it continues existing, it stays the same kind of thing. So his thought was, things go through lots of changes. Other than masses of matter, things go through lots of changes. What is it that keeps things being the kind of thing they are and not a different kind of thing? So as long as something continues, it will be what it is and nothing else. Well, he tried very hard, and he came up with these criteria. He said the thing about masses of matter is that they just don't grow. They are just the same. Add an atom to it, it's a different mass of matter. Take away an atom, it's a different mass of matter. It's a different piece of wood, a different lump of rock. But vegetables grow and change quite a lot. They start from little seeds, and they grow through seedlings up into mature plants. Animals actually do something even more dramatic. They grow, and as they grow, if they get damaged, they have some limited capacity for self-repair. And so do men. And later in his work, Locke's going to distinguish between being a man and being a person, because Locke thinks that it's possible for something to be a person and not a man, something to be a man and not a person. But men, or human beings, grow, repair, and change a lot. So Locke's great idea here is that whereas for masses of matter, it's just what they are made of that constitutes their identity, when it comes to vegetables, animals, and humans, it's much more to do with structure and organization. That's the kind of thing that determines their identity. They've got to have a functional structure, a functional organization that supports life, nourishment, and growth. This is very exciting. He's the first thinker who actually put these ideas forward and tried to think systematically about the differences between different kinds of things in this particular way. And it led Locke to this rather strange view. People find it a very puzzling view. I think it's quite a natural view, that each kind of thing has its own conditions of identity. And that's in his essay concerning human understanding, 1689. And the famous chapter on personal identity in that essay is in Book 2, Chapter 27. And I've given you on the last slide here a link to an internet resource where you can read about that. Now let's look at this idea that identity is suited to the idea. Just what sense can we make of that? As I said before, for Locke, to be a man and to be a person are very different. So, for example, Locke thinks that John could be the same man as Mr. Smith, but not the same person. How is this going to be possible? Ho, 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 this is going to be fun. How could that happen? Well, here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and you can think about them while you're looking at chapter 22 of your textbook, The Philosophy Gym, which has got a discussion of this kind of case. Mr. and Mrs. Smith are left over from the 2nd century, so they don't look very lively, so you've got to imagine that they are still alive. I couldn't find a suitable clip from the movie. You've probably seen that movie too, but I couldn't find one that was suitable for our use. So I've substituted Mr. and Mrs. Smith with this rather nice couple from the 2nd century. So there's Mrs. Smith. There's Mr. Smith. And let's suppose that Mr. Smith's first name is John. He's actually called John Smith. Now, how could it happen? How could it possibly be that John could be the same man as Mr. Smith, but not the same person? This is Locke's idea. How can he come up with an idea like this? Well, it's quite simple. One night, aliens with their advanced technology sneak in to where the Smiths are happily asleep in bed and they exchange the brains of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now, if your brain's really important to who you are, it could be that the body without the brain is still the body of Mr. Smith. John, with his wife's brain in his head, could still be the same man as Mr. Smith. But if the brain is important to your personal identity, his brain is no longer in that body. His wife's brain is in that body. His brain is in his wife's body. So he could be the same man as Mr. Smith. The rest of the body is the same. But he's not the same person, because if the person goes with the brain, his brain's now in his wife's body. See? So it's quite simple. If your brain determined your identity, if it's your brain that determines who you are, then if you take the same body minus the brain, apart from the brain, having the same body apart from the brain does not make you the same person. You're not the same person. Because if the brain's the critical thing, then it's where the brain goes that the person goes. And so what the aliens did was they swapped over two persons. They swapped the person that had previously been John by putting his brain into his wife's body. That person is now in the body of his wife. And the person who was his wife is now in the body that was John. Now, of course, Locke didn't know about the possibility of brain transplantations, so his own example of this is actually slightly more fanciful. At least some people might think it's more fanciful. It involves a shoemaker. Here's a picture of a shoemaker. Because what Locke wants to say is the body, as well as the soul, goes to making us human beings. In his words, the body as well as the soul goes to the making of a man. But if your thoughts depend on your brain, and a change of brain means a change of person, then for Locke, the thought was, he didn't think about the brain so much as the mind or the soul. And the thought that he would have had in the face of the story I've just told is, why not just say we are psychological things? Why not just say we are minds or souls? And that's how Locke did it. Locke said, imagine the following case. Imagine that a prince and a cobbler have a kind of mind swap. Not a brain swap like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, nothing concrete material, but a mind swap. And here's how he puts it in Book 2, Chapter 27. He says, should the soul of a prince, carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life, enter and inform the body of a cobbler, as soon deserted by his own soul, everyone sees he, the cobbler, would be the same person with the prince, accountable only for the prince's actions. But who would say it was the same man? So this is the case where you've got the prince's soul goes into the body of the cobbler. And now he wants to say that the prince has moved. He's changed bodies. Now, remember the quote I gave you from Locke at the beginning where I said everyone has primary property in his own body. His primary property in his own body. Clearly, what Locke is thinking is happening here is that when the soul of the prince enters the body of the cobbler, it acquires new property. The body of the cobbler becomes its property. And if the cobbler's soul goes into the prince's body, that soul has acquired new property too. And you just imagine, I mean, it's kind of vulgar thought, but you just imagine the experience of the prince if he wakes up, if this happens in the night, in the hovel belonging to the cobbler with this really disgusting surroundings, and he's come from the palace and he wakes up and where am I? What's all this? Who's this beside me? Yeah, where's the princess? Because it's Mrs. Cobbler who's there, not Madam Princess. And the other way around, the cobbler arrives in the palace and he wakes up in the morning and he says, wow, house has been redecorated overnight. Wow. And someone's bringing in a silver tray with breakfast. Wow. Right? So Locke thinks that if we could have a movement of mind, as he calls it, or soul, if we can have a movement of mind or soul between bodies, and that's just what the brain transplantation on my part was supposed to be. Locke thinks that if we could do that, then we could actually have a case where we have the same man, but no longer the same person. Wow. That's quite good, isn't it? That's quite an exciting thought experiment. Let's pause for a moment and take account of where we've got to. Normally, when I'm not recording lectures for iTunes, I give a break in lectures so that we can sit and think. But since we're using expensive video time, we just keep going and plow on. But anyway, let's stop for a moment and consider our progress. What have we seen so far? Well, if the arguments from Locke are right, then the sameness of body is not the same thing as sameness of person. Having the same body doesn't guarantee you're the same person after all. If I bump into you tomorrow and I say, oh, you were at my lecture yesterday, and you might say, no. Someone's mind has entered and informed my body in the meantime. Someone else's mind. I don't know what you're talking about. Sameness of body doesn't guarantee sameness of person. And as we'd say nowadays, I mean, what Locke says about the mind, we might nowadays want to say about the brain. So maybe the brain, the mind, the consciousness, something like that, has a special role to play in explaining our continuing identity, our personal identity. And here's Locke again. Locke says, self is that conscious thinking thing which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself, as far as that consciousness extends. And that's the memory criterion put in terms of consciousness. What Locke means by consciousness here is really just the memory criterion. Because consciousness is a kind of memory. But if you take Locke seriously, you get a very funny result coming out of this. If you take Locke seriously, it's very strange. Because if I'm conscious of what Guy Fawkes thought, felt, and experienced, doesn't that make me Guy Fawkes? If my consciousness extends to the life of someone who's been dead for 400 years, isn't that a way of making me that person? Self is that conscious thinking thing which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. As far as that consciousness extends. Well, if it extends to Guy Fawkes, doesn't that make me Guy Fawkes? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Let's think about that. Let's just stop a minute and think. Suppose there's a guy called Charles, and he wakes up one morning with all the memories of Guy Fawkes. My goodness, something's happened in the night. It's those aliens, those pesky aliens have been doing it again, right? He doesn't know about aliens. There's Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament in the Gunpowder Plot, along with millions of other people in 1705, I think. Charles not only has the memories of doing the Gunpowder Plot, he remembers all sorts of other things about late 17th century England. He knows things that history has never told us about Guy Fawkes. When he's interviewed by historians, they say, this is really good stuff. He really seems to know what was going on then. It's all consistent with what we know about the historical record. So people start to be convinced that he really does remember life in 16th and 17th century England. But by Locke's argument, this means that Charles is the same person as Guy Fawkes. But that can't be right. And you and I have got to come up with a counter-argument to this, because we just can't let someone waking up one morning with the memories of Guy Fawkes, however amazingly plausible they are, turn that person into Guy Fawkes, can we? We've got to think of some argument here that will show that this is a silly idea. And in fact, the work's been done for us, thank goodness, by the philosopher Bernard Williams, who came up with a brilliant counterexample and refutation of Locke's argument. I'll give you just a moment before I turn over to the next slide to think about how you do it. Not an argument that involves empirical information about how memory works or how brains work or anything like that. You've got to think about an argument that's just logical and focused on consistency and finding a contradiction. Remember how we did time travel? In time travel, we weren't interested in the physics and the empirical facts. What we were interested in was finding consistent stories and looking for contradictions. And Bernard Williams says there's a contradiction lurking in this story. And the contradiction Williams found in the story is saying, hey, the story you've told could actually happen to someone else. But that undermines the whole story. Suppose 1 week later, another fellow wakes up. Call him Robert. It was Charles who was the original guy we thought might be Guy Fawkes. Robert wakes up a week later with memories of Guy Fawkes, intimate knowledge of late 16th century London, and all the rest. Historians are convinced when they talk to him that he couldn't have got these other than by some mysterious process of actually having Guy Fawkes' real memories. Now, the argument we were supposed to be conned by, the argument we were supposed to be fooled by here, was the argument that said, if Charles is Guy Fawkes, then Charles and Guy Fawkes are one and the same person. Because what were we doing? We were using Locke's memory criterion. And we were saying, Charles has memories and awareness of this guy, Guy Fawkes, who lived 400 years ago. Charles has got these memories. Charles has got that awareness, right? That makes Charles Guy Fawkes. But Williams' counterexample says, but it's just as plausible to think that a week later, someone else called Robert goes through the very same experience, wakes up with the very same sets of memories, also apparently from Guy Fawkes. But Williams points out, Charles and Robert are two different people. Charles is not Robert. But then, since Charles and Robert are two different people, two is not one. Ho, 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 ho. So neither Charles nor Robert is Guy Fawkes. Because if we allowed them both to be Guy Fawkes, then Guy Fawkes would be two people. He'd be Charles and he'd also be Robert. But two isn't one. This cannot be a case of personal identity. You might find other ways of describing it. You might think it's a case of something a bit like personal identity. But it can't be identity, because identity is about how one thing stays one thing throughout its life. It's about oneness, not about two-ness or three-ness. Isn't that a nice argument? That's a cute argument. I like that argument. Because you don't need even to think about the empirical facts. You just think about telling another story and then refutation. There's another one of my memories. Is there another objection to Locke? Well, if you think again about the movie Memento, there is another objection to Locke, and this one isn't so nice as Bernard Williams' objection, but nonetheless it points to a real problem. If you think about Leonard, Leonard seems to function quite well throughout the movie, and it's quite a plausible movie. It's quite well functioning, despite enormous yawning chasms and gaps in his memory, and a rapid fading of short-term memory. He's got really rapid loss of short-term memory, but he's found ways around this, writing on his arms, writing the notes, writing on the mirrors, reminding himself all the time. So Leonard actually functions despite these gaps in his memory. And you might say that because of his continual goal to try and find out what happened to his wife, to find out what the trauma was, to find out what he can do about it, he functions like a single continuing person. He functions like a single continuing person. The trouble is he's functioning like a damaged person. He's a person who's got trouble orienting himself unless he uses the notes, the tattoos, and gets help from other people, because some of that help is dangerous. Some of that help actually leads to him being misled about things because he trusts the wrong people. But as far as Locke's concerned, Leonard actually ceased to be a person at the time of his wife's death, because his loss of memory after that is actually the loss of that very co-consciousness, which for Locke constitutes personal identity. So it looks as if Locke is setting too high a standard here. It can't be right to set the standard for personal identity as high as Locke sets it. So for Locke, Leonard ceased to be a person at the time of the death. The film makes it look as if that's an implausible reading, so that's another reason for thinking that memory on its own can't be a sufficient condition for identity. Okay. Are you with me so far? Is it intelligible? Have I gone too fast? Have I gone too slow? Have I gone just right? Okay, I think what we need to do now is to think about a problem that you can dwell on between now and the next lecture. The thoughts that we've had today about memory, and the thoughts we've had about brains and their role in carrying memories, or the mind, if you think the mind is a kind of software that runs on the brain, or consciousness, if it's something that's developed through the activity of your brain in collaboration with other parts of your body. That all raises questions about whether it's possible to imagine situations in which we actually produce more than one version of a person. And I just want to finish by thinking about that. If we had the right technology, could we actually fission people? Could we divide people in the way that cells, for example, divide into two exact replicas of themselves? And if what's important in personal identity, if what really matters is not your body, but your mental life, the consciousness that's carried by your brain, then maybe if we can do something to your brain, we can actually make two of you and put brains into different bodies. As, for example, this new version of the Smiths that my colleague Norvalo drew for me, I said, could she draw two dogs? It doesn't seem to me that she's drawn two dogs. It looks to me that Mr. and Mrs. Smith are a dog and a cat, which doesn't really work for my story. So can you pretend that the little black cat is actually a black dog? And she said that she'd made Mr. Smith pink because that was funny. Oh, thank you. I'll tell her you laughed. And she made Mrs. Smith black. And what we had thought in our thought experiment, remember, when we had the Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the tomb characters, what we thought in the thought experiment was that the aliens came in and swapped the brain. So the pink brain from Mr. Smith has gone into the black Mrs. Smith, and the grey brain from Mrs. Smith has gone into the pink Mr. Smith. But could we imagine something a bit more adventurous and exciting about that? Could we actually think about something that was a bit more challenging than just swapping over brains in the crude way we imagined? Instead of swapping brains, could we do something else to them? And here's the puzzle I'd like you to think about. Suppose it's possible to duplicate all the information, all the memories, all the processing that goes on in one half of your brain and actually duplicate it in the other half of your brain. So that if in surgery the brain is cut in two, the two half brains are perfect replicas of each other. They contain all the same information. They are able to be the basis for the same skills, the same thoughts, the same stream of consciousness. Imagine, now this is like time travel. I'm not saying you can do this, and you mustn't try it at home. But just imagine that it was possible to do that. So imagine that you could duplicate one hemisphere of your brain and put that into a body that had lost its brain. Now, we're not worried about what that body looks like. We're not worried as to whether it's pink or black, whether it's in the shape of a cat or a dog. We're not worried about that body. It's just another human body that's unfortunately lost its brain and it's needing one. So it gets half a brain into it. Half the brain that's been treated so it's an exact replica of the half the brain left in the original body. So now you've got two bodies with very, very similar brains in them. Brains that are exact duplicates. Now, the question is, would that be a way of making two people? Would that be a way of making two of you? Would it be possible to use that as a way of duplicating people so that people can fission into two. Now, of course, your identity would not be preserved by this, but you'd get multiple lives out of it. So just think about this, because next week I want to talk about problems of identity and fission. And I want to talk about problems of personal identity in the context of thinking about problems of physical object identity as well, and going back to thinking about bodies and their role in identity. Okay, thank you for your attention. See you at the next lecture.